reconciliation, and you will be blessed by the things we talk about today. Hello, I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and just bring your own refreshments. Butterfly shrimp, really healthy for that omega-3 or whatever it is, stuff your doctor tells you to eat, and no coincidence, and not to be offensive, Shana Tova Umetuka. That is Hebrew for happy and sweet New Year. Today is, actually it started yesterday, is Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year for your Jewish friends. Hey, here's some Hebrew flashcards. Learn the language, as it says in the Book of Mormon. Nephi says one of the best ways to understand Isaiah is understand the manner and the things and the ways of the Jews. So understand the calendar is different. Understand the language as you can, or do something to learn about the Jews for Jewish New Year. Excuse me. But we're here to talk about the New Testament, the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, it's an interesting epistle. With Romans and 1 Corinthians, we've got a lot of high theology doctrine. This one's a little different. It's more conversational. There's talk about the travels that he had. It's more conciliatory and reconciliatory. Plus, this has a lot of quotable quotes. For example, chapter 4, verses 8 through 10, chapter 6, verses 5 through 11. You can read those on your own. This is get to the point, so I keep things very brief. And like I said, it's a little bit easier to read. It's a smaller book. But on top of that, there's some interesting scholarship about this book. And what it is there may actually be, we have 2 epistles, but there may actually be 4 epistles to the Corinthians. So we're all agreed that there's a missing first epistle. So we call this zero Corinthians. Then what we have is 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter to the Corinthians. And then there's some debate whether or not there's a third epistle between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And this is called the severe letter, or the Epistle of Tears. And as you're reading 2 Corinthians, so you have 1 Corinthians, you know that there's obviously a gap there. But 2 Corinthians, it seems that Paul may have sent this really vicious, I'm not sure if vicious is the right word, a very severe, sharp and pointed letter to the Corinthians. We understand there's a lot of problems going on there, and he may have had written a follow-up one between this what we have called the first and second epistles that was very severe. And this second epistle may be the reason why it's so conciliatory, and like in section 121 is showing forth an increase of love after you rebuke someone. And so this is a very soft and gentle epistle. And there's also some scholarship that suggests that the last chapters 10, 11, 12, 13 may be part of this severe epistle that got appended to the back of 2 Corinthians. We know there's a lot of monkey business going on in the transmission process. Things were taken out, things were put in, there were changes made, and that may be part of it. And also, you have, for example, in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1, it says, "This is the third time I'm coming to you." If that was part of this third epistle, and 2 Corinthians is the fourth epistle, that explained that discrepancy. But since we don't have the primary sources, we're kind of do the best we can as much as we, with what we have. And I'm not a person who's going to say, I'm not going to lay down the law. I said, from the evidence we have, from the understanding that we have, this is the conclusion we make, but I'm not going to be hard and fast with that. And so Paul is showing forth an increase of love after his rebuke. Now, 2 Corinthians begins with this message of hope. And it's talking about the hope in Jesus Christ. And we need to make a distinction. There's a difference between having hope and then having hope in Jesus Christ. In the same way, there's a difference between having faith and also having faith in Jesus Christ. Think about this. Why do we need to have hope in Jesus Christ? Why does Christ have to be the object upon which our hope rests, as opposed to hope in general, hope as a concept, or hope in a political figure, or a social crusader, or what have you? Also, Paul talks about fleshly wisdom, and that's a problem that the Corinthians had. This is the area of Socrates with all the philosophers, where philosophy had much greater sway than it does right now. And people were trusting that there's compelling power with philosophy. A couple of books called the Consolation of Philosophy and Guide for the Perplexed, The Incoherence of Philosophers. Philosophy is really powerful. It's a very effective way of explaining things, but there's limitations to it. We need to make sure that we're not getting seduced by men's philosophies or devil's doctrines, but focusing on what Christ taught, not getting sucked into really seductive teachings. They talk about it also in, I think it's section 46, about the gifts of the Spirit and men's philosophies and doctrines of the devil, and 2 Nephi 28 also discusses that. It makes sure you're understanding the difference, why we need to, how men's philosophies can distract us from Jesus Christ. So, as we're reading this, Paul talks about the overmuch sorrow. He's really worked up, and like I said, he's trying to make things right or smooth things out with the letter he sent to the Corinthians. And this is a little bit what Alma the Younger experienced in the Book of Mormon. Alma 4, verse 15. He spoke about the corrupting members, and Alma felt very sorrowful. Nevertheless, the Spirit of the Lord did not fail him. And then when Alma the Younger went to the Zoramites, the Rameumptom people, it says in Alma 31, verse 1, that his heart again began to sicken because of the iniquity of the people. Do you have that reaction to false doctrine when you show up to church and the spirit gets a little bit off? Someone makes a comment in Sunday school or quorum or Relief Society, and it's not quite right. You just kind of let fly over your shoulder. If there's a problem going on, do you speak up? What's your reaction? Or you say, "Oh, that's that person's idea," or are you having this appropriate anger and sickened? You feel sickened when you hear stuff in church that's not quite true. So think about that. Paul uses this expression that we are living epistles. That is a great expression. President Nelson alluded to that when he, about having things written on our heart when he talked about the Restoration Proclamation. What's your example like? Or are you being a good example to people? If you were a book of Scripture, how'd you read? Now, getting near the end of this, in 2 Corinthians 3, verses 13 and 18, Paul talks about veils. It's a little bit confusing. What he's talking about is alluding to a story in the Old Testament. It's found in Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 through 35. 34, verses 29 to 35. Moses was up on the mountain. When he came down off the mountain, like Abinadi, his face was shining. And Joseph Smith had the same experience too. A lot of Wilford Woodruff mentioned this, that his face started shining brilliantly, and it just threw the people off, and they stood back from him. So Moses delivered his message and then put a veil on his face. And this is what happened with Abinadi, and that's the illusion. As Abinadi was teaching, they're discussing Isaiah and the law of Moses, and right in the middle, Abinadi's face starts shining. And that's just God's way of saying, you remember how Moses' face shone? Well, Abinadi has the same sign. It's a little bit like the Transfiguration, where Brigham Young looked like Joseph Smith. It's a witness to members that God's endorsing what's going on. But the allegorical or metaphorical point is that the law of Moses is like a veil. Moses had to put a veil on his face. He took it off when he talked with God. When he was talking with people, he put a veil on his face so they couldn't see the face shining. And the law of Moses is like that. As good as it is, and there's certainly a lot of benefits from the law of Moses, it's not the full gospel. And did you know, in the law of Moses, you could not eat shrimp? And there's other things, whereas of the New Order, yeah, you can eat shrimp. It's just eat a healthy food. And what happens is with Jesus Christ, Christ removes the veil. There's no blockage to the spirituality. And as Paul says, as we embrace the gospel and come unto Christ, what happens is that we'll slowly be changed into Christ's image. It'll be just like looking in a mirror. We see the expression looking to a glass. That's a looking glass, a mirror like a Alice in Wonderland. But our countenance will be so much like Jesus Christ, it'll be as if we're looking in a mirror. Alma talks about this, Alma 5, verse 19. Have you received his image in your countenance? They also talk about this in the Lectures on Faith. Lecture 7, verse 16, it says that as we're obedient, we'll be assimilated into Christ's likeness. That the Spirit upon us, we're going to be conformed to His image. That's some very interesting stuff. It's very consistent throughout the Scriptures about being like Christ. There's a little bit more to it than what we had talked about. So to change subjects a little bit, just make sure we're clear on something. The devil is the god of the world, and Jesus Christ is the God of the whole earth. 3 Nephi 11:14, Christ says, I am the God of the whole earth, but the devil is the god of the world. Understanding with worldliness, how the world and the earth are not synonymous terms, and the world refers to the wicked system that goes on. That's what Joseph Smith taught. There's also some discussion about our physical bodies, how Paul's body wastes away. Like I said, there's some really good quotable quotes in this. This is Paul, where he's writing a really good quote book here about our physical bodies wasting away. So we're running out of time. We're at 11 minutes. So talk a little bit about being unequally yoked. 2 Corinthians 6:14. And a lot of this, people understand this to be marrying non-members, marrying outside the covenant. Although Paul in 1 Corinthians talks a little bit about there can be some benefits to marrying outside the covenant, although there's some obvious friction. Go back to the Jewish example, Hanukkah bush or Christmas tree. How do you celebrate? Do you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah, or do you do both? You're in love, you're getting caught up with the emotion, but once you start having to ask some important questions that go beyond the emotion, do you get married in the temple? And what does it mean to be not married in the temple, even if you love the person? Mercy cannot rob justice. President Nelson talks about this. You can't build a marriage on wishful thinking. That you do have to obey its obedience to the laws and ordinances of the gospel. But unequally yoked, what about our strategic alliances? What about our interfaith dialogues? Are we converting them? Or are they converting us? Are we losing things? Are we soft-pedaling things like the Joseph Smith translation in order to make good with some of our Protestant friends? It's not a neutral or just a net positive. Sometimes it can be a negative effect where as you sit there and hear people talk, it's like you're getting that's not from the Scriptures. You're getting these ideas from other places. And if you borrowed them from another religion, you should probably return them, because what we have is a lot better. Joseph Smith, and I say this because my take on this goes back to Joseph Smith, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 306. I use Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith because that's the more accessible book. The Joseph Smith Papers is more accurate, but it's cumbersome, and most people have a copy of Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, so you can flip to it. If you're curious, you can backsource it to the Joseph Smith Papers. And you probably heard they're going to have a new biography on Joseph Smith come out. That's sort of the capstone to the Joseph Smith Papers. President Oaks announced that. But back to Joseph Smith, Teachings, page 306, and where Joseph Smith, when he was asked about forming temperance societies, and those are the stuff, opposing alcohol, that type of thing, Joseph Smith responded, don't be unequally yoked with non-members. There's some benefits, there's also some negatives, and sometimes the negatives outweigh the benefits. So this is get to the point. We're at 13 and a half minutes. Here's the Christ quotient, how I wind things up, make sure that we're founding our discussion on Jesus Christ. Christ is full of grace and truth. And this epistle is about having grace and offering grace to people, reconciling a relationship where you had to rebuke someone. But are you offering the rebuke when it's necessary? Or are you keeping quiet? Denial in order to preserve a relationship. Denying things in order to preserve a relationship. Or is a branch need to be pruned that you're not pruning? And is it causing the whole tree to get diseased? Denial about problems. Keeping quiet, going along to get along. What does it mean to be a living epistle, which is Paul's term? How's your example going? Are you converting other people, or other people converting you? And I like to go back to the veil image that Paul used, lifting the veil. Now, most people were not really having issues with the law of Moses. I've never shown up to church and no one showed up. Hey, you can't eat shrimp because that's against the law of Moses. It's never happened. Eating blood sausages has. A friend of mine described it as eating a scab, but I'm not going to go there. But are we following the churches? Are we doing things the old way or the new way? President Uchtdorf, Elder Uchtdorf says, are we going back to the future? Where are we just getting stuck in old ruts and we're not advancing? For example, are you solving problems using the council system as opposed to having the key-holding high priest issue autocratic diktats? Showing up, here's the problem, you do this, you do that, you do this, and that will solve the problem. Or are you counseling together, getting better solutions than one person can get, using the revelatory process? And this is how it works. You study it out, then you get revelation. You read the Bible, you think about it, then you go to the sacred grove and you get the first vision. And the same thing applies to problems in the wards. You talk with people to get more information. That's how President Nelson called us counselors. To get revelation, you need information. Same thing with families, how you solve family problems. Does mom or dad come in, or does dad say, okay, do things this way, and then behind your back, mom says, let's do things the other way? Or do the kids just ignore everyone? Are you issuing orders, or are you counseling together? Come now, let us reason together, Isaiah says. Are you using the correct name of the church? Are you stuck on a rut on that? President Nelson said one of the barriers to doing missionary work is using the incorrect name of the church. Go back there and read his talk. That's what he says. How about come follow me? Is it come follow me or go get lost? Using that, and that's why I'm doing this video here, is to make sure that to be as a resource. I'm going to almost hitting 17 minutes. I want to keep this short. But come follow me. Keeping church to 2 hours, or are you trying to wiggle in a third hour there? Are you a meeting-aholic, or are you following the prophets? So those are some things to think about as we strive to lift the veil. And as we lift the veil, we come into Christ, we get assimilated into his likeness. And being like Christ, that's the point.